All right, let's dive in. This time, we're looking at water.
Lots of water.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of water.
A deep dive, you could say.
You got it. A deep dive into hydrology and flood management. And, I have to say, your notes and excerpts are really fascinating this time around.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, you've got stuff about India's approach to water budgeting. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Well, it's funny because when you first think about it, you think about the science of water, and then you think about, where rain gathers, and then you think about how we deal with floods. And it seems like these are all separate topics, but they're all really interconnected.
Oh, absolutely. Like, it's all this big interconnected dance.
Exactly.
So we need to figure out the choreography, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. Hydrology 101. What is it?
Well, you have a definition here. It says it's about how water is distributed, how it moves both above and below the surface, and how humans impact it.
And speaking of impact, you have some notes here about the global water budget. Now, I'm guessing that's not about tracking my spending on bottled water.
No, not at all. The global water budget is really the balance between the inputs and outputs and stores of water in the entire system, like this delicate balancing act.
Between what?
Between evaporation and precipitation.
Oh.
So, evaporation,
Yeah.
precipitation, it ensures this continuous cycle.
So what happens if that balancing act gets disrupted? Like, what are the real-world implications of that?
Well, I mean, think about it. If more water evaporates than falls back as precipitation, then you're looking at droughts. And if you have too much rainfall, well, then you're going to have flooding. So this seemingly simple concept of a water budget is actually determining whether we have enough water to, drink, grow crops, maintain ecosystems. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And you flank something about India's unique approach to water budgeting. Yeah. I was super intrigued by your note about Kerala being the first state in India to implement a water budget. What's so special about their approach?
Well, while the global water budget looks at the big picture, India looks more locally. So they actually create these documents that assess the water availability and use within specific regions, taking into account their unique needs and challenges.
So it's almost like they create a customized water plan for each region.
Exactly. It's a fantastic example of taking a global concept and applying it to a local challenge.
Which makes a lot of sense given how diverse the geography and climate is in India.
Absolutely.
So we've got this global water dance happening, but water doesn't just flow freely across the planet. You have a ton of notes about catchment areas. I mean, what are those?
Well, that's where the water collects and flows. And, you mentioned something interesting in your notes about school catchment areas.
Ah, yes. Good old school catchment areas.
Yeah, you know how those boundaries determine which school you go to?
Yeah, that brings back memories and headaches.
Well, just like that. Natural catchments also have these boundaries that dictate where the water flows. Think of a basin surrounded by hills or ridges. It's like a giant funnel, directing all the rainfall within that area toward a common outlet.
So all the rain that falls in that basin is going to end up in their rivers and streams and wetlands at the bottom.
Exactly. And understanding these boundaries is absolutely crucial for managing water resources, especially when you're thinking about flooding.
Okay, I see the connection now. But what determines those boundaries in the first place? What shapes a catchment area?
Well, there's several factors. Distance, travel time, water can only travel so far, geographical boundaries like mountains and valleys, and then, even population can play a role because humans can alter natural drainage patterns.
It's a lot to think about, like a giant puzzle figuring out how all these factors kind of interlock. And speaking of interconnections, your notes about floods, I'm really curious. What is a flood?
It's interesting. You actually have a definition here that says a flood is an overflow of water onto land. It sounds very simple, but the consequences can be catastrophic.
Yeah, you even have an entire section dedicated to flood hazards, specifically the impact of cyclones and storm surges. Like, why is that such a big deal?
Well, floods are a prime example of natural hazards, events that threaten lives and property and the environment. And one reason floods are so dangerous is they often follow predictable patterns.
There's some logic to their chaos.
There is. So flooding often occurs in certain areas repeatedly because of, the topography, rainfall patterns, even human interventions like dam construction.
Right.
So, coastal areas are naturally vulnerable to storm surges and cyclones. But we've also seen how development and deforestation can make flooding worse.
So we're playing a role in amplifying the risks.
Exactly. And you highlighted something about the destructive power of storm surges, specifically the damage to buildings, beaches, roads, and bridges.
Well,
So the force of waves during a cyclone can erode beaches and damage infrastructure. And they can even undermine the foundations of buildings. And this constant agitation by the water can cause serious structural damage.
so it's a sobering thought, right? That even seemingly harmless water can turn into this powerful force of destruction.
Oh, yeah.
What are some other common causes of floods besides cyclones?
Well, heavy rainfall is an obvious one. It's not just the amount, but the intensity and duration of the rainfall. And then there's melting snow and ice. Melting glaciers in the Himalayas can lead to these sudden devastating floods downstream. And you had some really fascinating notes on glacial lake outburst floods, or GLOFs.
Oh, yeah. I was reading about those. Terrifying. So it's not just rain we need to worry about, but also these sudden releases of water from melting glaciers.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the risk of dam or levee breaks, which can unleash massive amounts of water downstream.
Right. Okay, so we've got these powerful forces at play. We know they can be destructive. But how do we even begin to predict when and where they're going to strike?
Right. Well, that's where the challenge of estimating flood discharge comes in. And this is where your notes get really interesting. You highlighted 6 different methods for predicting flood discharge, and each one has its own strengths and limitations.
6. Wow. I have to admit, my eyes kind of glazed over when I saw that in the notes.
Yeah.
Maybe we could just focus on a couple that are really relevant. What about the catchment-runoff method? That seemed pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's a great one to start with. Basically, you use rainfall data and information about the catchment area, remember we were just talking about that, to calculate how much water could potentially flow into the rivers and streams.
That's like connecting the dots between rainfall and runoff.
Yeah.
Right. Using those characteristics of the catchment to predict how much water will actually end up in those rivers.
Exactly. And then there are empirical formulae, which are basically pre-existing formulas based on the location and characteristics of a catchment area.
So ready-made calculations.
Ready-made calculations based on what we already know about a particular area. And then there's a rational method, which focuses on the average intensity of rainfall over time.
So it's not just how much rain falls, but also how intensely it falls over time.
Yeah.
So a really short, intense burst of rain could be just as dangerous as like a longer, gentler rainfall.
Exactly. That's the point.
Okay.
And one more tool you highlighted that I wanted to talk about, unit hydrographs.
Yes.
Huh.
I've come across that term before, but I admit I don't fully grasp it. Can you break it down for us?
Think of it this way. Imagine a spike on a heart rate monitor right after you sprint. Well, a unit hydrograph basically shows that spike, but for a river, after a burst of rain. It's this graphical representation that lets us see how water levels change, rise, and fall over time in response to rainfall.
Oh, so it's like a visual timeline of a river's reaction to rain.
Exactly.
That makes it much easier to understand.
Good.
And I'm guessing that this visual representation helps us to predict floods.
Absolutely. They're incredibly useful for flood forecasting and managing water resources. By understanding how a river responds to rainfall, we can then predict how much water is going to flow downstream, how long it's going to take to reach certain points.
That's amazing. So by studying those patterns, we can anticipate those floods and then take steps to protect ourselves.
Exactly. And that brings us to another level of understanding flood dynamics, and that's flood frequency.
Okay, so now we're not just talking about predicting a single flood event, but really understanding those long-term patterns. How often do floods of certain sizes happen?
Exactly. So flood frequency studies, they analyze historical data and use probability distributions to predict how likely it is for floods of certain magnitudes to occur in the future.
So using the past to understand the future of flooding.
Exactly. And this understanding lets us then design flood protection measures that are appropriate for the level of risk in a particular area.
It makes sense. This reminds me what you were talking about earlier with India's water budgeting approach. I'm curious, are those flood frequency analyses also tailored to specific regions in India?
I'm not entirely sure about that, but it would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
To incorporate that data. I mean, understanding the likelihood of floods is crucial for managing water resources.
That's true. So how do engineers decide what level of flood frequency to consider when they're designing things like dams or levees? Is there like a standard benchmark?
It really depends on the importance of the structure. So for, a minor structure, they might use like a 10 or 50-year flood frequency,
What does that mean?
meaning a 1 in 10 or a 1 in 50 chance of a flood of that magnitude happening in any given year. But for major dams or, critical infrastructure, they might use a 100 or even a 500-year flood frequency.
Wow, so those really important structures are built to withstand incredibly rare events.
They are. And one of the tools, the statistical tools they use to analyze flood frequency is called the Gumbel distribution. It's particularly good at predicting extreme events like those really, really rare massive floods that could have these devastating consequences.
So it's like a specialized tool for understanding those outliers, those extreme events that could really wreak havoc.
Exactly. But even with all of these sophisticated tools, you have to remember that flood frequency studies have limitations.
Of course, nothing's perfect.
No.
What are some limitations?
Well, they're ultimately forms of extrapolation. So we're using past data to try to predict future events, but the future doesn't always behave like the past.
Especially with climate change. And you have a note here about how it impacts flood prediction. How is that throwing a wrench into things?
Well, climate change is changing everything. It's altering rainfall patterns, intensifying storms. It's even causing sea levels to rise. All of these changes make it harder to just rely on historical data to predict what those future flood events will be.
So it's like we're trying to predict the future while the rules of the game are constantly changing.
Right.
That's a great analogy. And it really highlights the need for ongoing research and adaptation. Like, we have to constantly update our models and, keep up with the changing climate.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on the past to predict the future, especially with something as complex as water.
Yeah, no kidding. So we've covered a lot of ground already. We started with the global water cycle, zoomed in on those fascinating catchment areas. We even explored those mind-boggling complexities of flood prediction.
It's been quite the journey.
It has. But we've only just dipped our toes into the world of water.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
I can't wait. But for now, let's take a break and come back to dive even deeper.
As we continue this deep dive, I think it's the perfect time to think about how we actually manage the risk of flooding.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You can have all the data and the models in the world, but if you don't use them to actually protect people and communities, what's the point? So let's talk flood management. Your notes mention a whole bunch of approaches from those massive dams and levees to like more nature-based solutions.
It's true. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Each region, each community has its own unique needs and challenges when it comes to flooding.
Right, so let's break down some of those different approaches.
Yeah.
What are some examples of, the structural measures like dams and levees?
Well, I think dams are probably the most iconic examples of flood control structures. Those massive barriers designed to hold back huge volumes of water, creating these reservoirs that can be used for irrigation, drinking water, and of course, flood control.
Yeah, it's a monumental task.
Yeah.
What are some of the engineering challenges involved in building something like a dam?
There are so many. You have to design them to withstand the immense pressure of floodwaters. And you have to make sure they're built on stable ground so they don't breach.
Right, so many factors. And you mentioned levees, too, so those are the raised embankments, right?
Right, along rivers or coastlines.
Right.
Yeah, they're like protective walls preventing water from spilling over into surrounding areas. And they're often used alongside dams or as standalone structures to protect, vulnerable communities and infrastructure.
But we've seen the devastating consequences when dams or levees fail, right? So it's a sobering reminder that these structures need to be carefully designed and maintained.
Oh, absolutely. And you actually highlighted a case study where a levee breach led to catastrophic flooding.
Right.
And it just underscores how important regular inspections are and proper maintenance and even upgrades, because we have to ensure these structures can handle the increasing intensity of floods that we're seeing with climate change.
So it's not just building it, it's that ongoing commitment to keeping it functional and safe.
Exactly.
What are some of the drawbacks to, relying so heavily on these dams and levees?
Well, one major concern is their impact on the natural flow of rivers and the ecosystems.
Oh, right, of course.
Dams can block fish migration, disrupt sediment flow, they can alter downstream habitats.
It's like we're trying to tame this wild animal, right?
Yeah.
We might be able to contain it temporarily, but there are always unforeseen consequences.
It's a great analogy. And then there's also the cost factor. Building and maintaining these massive structures can be incredibly expensive.
So it's this balancing act, right? We're weighing the benefits of flood protection against the potential ecological and economic costs. And your notes also mention these nature-based solutions. So how do those differ from the traditional structural approaches?
Well, instead of trying to control the water with just concrete and steel, nature-based solutions work with nature's processes to reduce the flood risk.
Okay.
It's like mimicking and enhancing the natural systems to manage water in a more sustainable and integrated way.
So it's more about harnessing the power of nature, right?
Yeah.
Rather than trying to dominate it. That sounds kind of counterintuitive.
It does, but there are some really ingenious examples of this approach. You have a whole section here about wetland restoration
Oh, yeah.
and its role in flood management.
I was really drawn to those examples. I love wetlands. And the idea that you can use them to actually mitigate floods just seems so brilliant.
It is. They act like natural sponges, so they absorb excess water during floods and then slowly release it back into the ecosystem.
So it's like giving the river more room to breathe,
Yes.
letting it spread out and slow down during those high flows, rather than trying to confine it to like a really narrow channel.
Exactly. And by restoring those natural areas, we're not just reducing the flood risk, we're creating habitats for wildlife, filtering pollutants, improving the water quality.
But surely there are some trade-offs, right? I mean,
Right.
are there communities who might actually be negatively impacted by, wetland restoration projects?
You're absolutely right. And you're right to highlight the social and economic aspects of any flood management strategy.
Right.
While wetland restoration offers these numerous benefits, it's crucial to make sure those projects are implemented in a way that actually considers the needs of all the stakeholders.
Yeah, we have to make sure those nature-based solutions are truly beneficial for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
What are some other examples of nature-based flood management?
Well, there's riparian buffering,
What is that?
which involves planting trees and vegetation along riverbanks.
I'm curious, how does planting trees prevent floods?
Well, imagine those trees and shrubs acting like a natural barrier. The roots help stabilize the soil, preventing erosion, and then the vegetation itself helps slow down the flow of water.
So cool. It's like using nature's own tools to protect ourselves from the forces of nature.
Hmm.
But are these nature-based solutions always a viable option?
They're not a silver bullet, and they're not suitable in every situation,
Right.
but they do often offer a more sustainable and cost-effective alternative to those traditional structural measures.
So it's really about finding that balance, right?
Yeah,
Between human intervention and letting nature do its thing.
exactly. And this brings up another critical aspect of flood management that you highlighted, and that's community engagement.
Yes, community engagement. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the technical aspects of flood management, but at the end of the day, it's really about protecting people and communities.
Oh, absolutely. Effective flood management requires a collaborative approach that brings together scientists, engineers, policymakers, and, of course, the communities themselves.
Right. It's really about understanding the local context, the specific needs and vulnerabilities of different communities.
Exactly. Communities often have such a deep understanding of their local environment, the historical patterns of flooding, and the unique challenges that they face.
Right. So how can we make sure those community voices are actually heard and incorporated into those flood management plans?
Well, that's a great question, and it really starts with open communication, actively involving community members in the planning process. It's about listening to their concerns, respecting their knowledge, and working together to develop solutions that meet their specific needs.
It's really about empowering communities, right?
Absolutely.
To be active participants in their own resilience.
Exactly. And that empowerment can take so many forms, from educating communities about flood risks and evacuation plans to actually encouraging them to adopt, flood-resistant building practices.
So it's about recognizing that flood management isn't just about reacting to events. It's really about building this culture of preparedness and resilience.
Absolutely. And part of that long-term resilience is understanding things like flood insurance, having a family emergency plan, knowing the safest evacuation routes. It's about being prepared for the inevitable, knowing that floods will happen, and having that plan in place to minimize the impact.
It's like that saying, hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. I love that.
Exactly.
And I think we have one more piece of the puzzle to discuss here, and that's the role of technology in flood management. I mean, how is technology changing the game?
Oh, technology is revolutionizing how we monitor, predict, and respond to floods.
So what are some of the really exciting advancements?
Well, I think one of the biggest areas is flood forecasting and early warning systems.
Hmm.
So now we have access to all this real-time data from satellites, weather radar, ground-based sensors,
Wow.
and it gives us really precise information about, rainfall, river levels, even soil
It's
moisture.
like having a constant stream of information about all the conditions that could lead to a flood, right?
Exactly. And then all of that data is fed into these really sophisticated computer models that can actually predict flood events. And now we can predict these flood events days, even weeks in advance.
Which gives communities that valuable time to prepare, right?
Exactly. It can be life-saving.
Yeah.
Giving people time to evacuate, protect their belongings, take steps to minimize damage.
Yeah, it's incredible. But these technological advancements aren't just limited to prediction, are they? I mean, they're also transforming how we respond to floods.
Oh, absolutely.
How so?
Well, think about drones.
Okay.
They're now equipped with cameras and sensors that can be deployed to assess flood damage in real time.
Wow.
And that gives emergency responders this critical information, even in those areas that are hard to reach.
It's like having eyes in the sky, right?
Yeah.
You can get this clear picture of the situation, even in the most challenging conditions.
Exactly. And then you have GIS, geographic information systems,
Oh, yeah.
which are such powerful tools for mapping floodplains, identifying areas at risk, and even simulating different flood scenarios.
It's remarkable how technology is helping us understand and manage these really complex events in ways we couldn't even imagine a few decades ago.
It's truly a game changer.
So it's an exciting time to be working in flood management. It feels like there's so much potential for innovation and progress.
Oh, there is. And, as we grapple with the increasing challenge of climate change and urbanization, this field is only going to become even more critical.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I mean, we started with the fundamentals of hydrology. We explored those intricate catchment areas. We delved into the complexities of flood prediction. And now we've gone through the diverse world of flood management.
It's been quite the expedition.
It really has.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key takeaways here is that, effective flood management really requires this holistic approach.
Yes, it does.
What do you mean by holistic in this context?
Well, it means recognizing that flooding isn't just a technical challenge.
Okay.
It's a social, economic, and environmental issue.
Right.
We have to consider the needs of communities, the health of ecosystems, the long-term sustainability of our solutions.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, connecting the dots between the science, the engineering, the policy, and the people.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And as we continue to learn and adapt to, the changing world around us, that interconnectedness is just going to become more and more important.
So before we wrap up this section of our deep dive, what's one thing that you wish everyone understood about flood management?
That's a great question. I think the one thing I would emphasize is that flood management is everyone's responsibility.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not just for governments and engineers to worry about.
So it's about empowering individuals to take action, to be part of the solution. What can ordinary people actually do to contribute to flood management in their communities?
Oh, there's so many things. Even small actions can make a big difference. Things like clearing storm drains to prevent blockages, using rain barrels to collect rainwater, planting trees to help absorb excess runoff. We can also advocate for more sustainable development practices in our communities, supporting policies that prioritize green infrastructure, responsible land use.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play, right, in protecting ourselves and our communities from those risks.
Absolutely.
Our individual actions combined with those larger scale efforts can make a real difference.
Exactly. And the more we understand about the forces at play, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions and create a more resilient future.
Well said. Now let's take a short break and come back to wrap up our deep dive into the world of water.
And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into water. It's amazing how much we've already covered. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to a couple of those little intriguing things that you had flagged in your notes. Do you remember that whole thing about a state in India that was pioneering water budgeting? Kerala, yeah.
Yeah.
What was so special about their approach?
Well, they basically took a really broad concept like the global water budget and localized it.
Okay.
They created this detailed plan for managing their water resources at a much smaller scale.
Yeah. It's really inspiring.
It is.
They really embrace that whole idea of adapting these global concepts to fit their own local challenges.
Yeah.
Now, what about those unit hydrographs? I still don't think I fully get it.
They're basically like visual timelines of how a river responds to rainfall.
So if you can imagine a graph, right, and it shows how the river's water level rises and falls over time after a burst of rain.
Okay.
And it's like a fingerprint. It's unique to each catchment area. And it helps us understand how water moves across the landscape.
So it's not just some, abstract scientific concept. It sounds like these unit hydrographs are really powerful tools for managing floods.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, hydrologists use them to predict how much water will flow downstream, how long it will take to get to certain points, and even to identify those areas that are most vulnerable to flooding.
Wow. So it's amazing how something that seems so theoretical can actually have those really practical applications in the real world. You also had some really interesting notes about flood frequency analysis. What was it that stood out to you the most?
Well, it's fascinating how scientists can use historical data and probability distributions, right, to predict how likely floods are to happen in the future.
Yeah.
Of different sizes. Almost like predicting the weather, but instead of, rain or sunshine, we're looking at those extreme water events.
Yeah. So it's all about understanding those long-term patterns and recognizing that floods are just, a natural part of the water cycle.
Exactly.
And being prepared for them.
Exactly. So that means we can design infrastructure that can withstand them, and we can implement early warning systems and develop those evacuation plans, to minimize the risk.
So it's really about being proactive and not reactive.
But
It seems like we've come full circle, back to that whole idea of interconnectedness, right?
we have.
From exploring, the science of water to where it gathers, and then ultimately how we manage it.
It's been quite the journey.
It really has. And I think one of the most important takeaways from all of this is that water is this precious resource. And it demands, respect and stewardship.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. I mean, it's been truly enlightening.
Well, thank you for having me. And it's always great to talk about this with curious minds.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a much deeper understanding of hydrology, flood management, and the vital role that water plays in our lives. And remember, the journey doesn't end here, Keep diving deep, keep asking questions, keep the conversation flowing. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.